Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Just going to recite the verses of Surah Al-Fatiha, which is the opening chapter in the Bible of the Muslims. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen, Ar-Rahmanir Rahim, Maliki إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا Translation for is, in the name of Allah, the Beneficent, the Merciful, praise be to Allah, Lord of the worlds, the Beneficent, the Merciful, Owner of the Day of Judgment. Thee alone we worship, Thee alone we ask for help. Guide us on the straight path, the path of those whom Thou hast favored, not the path of those who earn Thine anger, and nor those who go astray. Amen. Thank you very much.
Praise be to God, Lord of the worlds, and peace and blessings upon His noble messenger. Assalamu alaikum, peace be with you. We decided to split up this talk, an introduction to the 5 basic duties of Islam, and then an introduction to the basic beliefs of Islam. So just thinking about Islam itself, often people start with a definition of the word. It's an Arabic word. There is some value in thinking about what Islam means, because Muslims believe it's a God-given name for the religion. So unlike Christianity, which is named after Christ, and it's a name that developed long after the time of Christ, Judaism named after the tribe of Judah, Hinduism, the Indus Valley, the civilization around there, Buddhism, Confucianism, and so on. Islam, Muslims believe, is a God-given term, and Muslims believe it's the religion of all of God's prophets, and sort of final summation in the revelation to the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. And those of you who may have studied Arabic know that Arabic words can normally be broken down into a triliteral root, 3 root letters, and they give it like a semantic field. So they give you more of a meaning than just the definition of the word, but they give you a feeling of how that word is used and what its connotations are. So in Islam, the root letters are Sin, Lam, and Mim there on the top right, and equivalent to sort of S, L, and M in English. So from that you get Salam, Muslim, Salama, Salim, all of these words. And the meanings are to do with submission, so submission to the will of God, submitting your will, willingly, consciously, lovingly to the will of God. Peace, Salam, is related to this, achieving peace through that as the only way to true peace. Security and soundness, all of these themes are covered or related to these 3 root letters. So that's one definition. A more practical definition was given by the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. So there's a famous narration that many Muslims learn as children or later on, that the angel Gabriel came down as a man and came to the Prophet Muhammad, and the people around didn't know who he was, and started to ask him questions. He asked him, what is Islam? What is Iman? What is Ihsan? Which is sort of excellence, you might translate it as that. And then he asked about the Day of Judgment, of which no one knows when the Day of Judgment will be. Then he asked about its signs, and the one that everyone remembers is the Prophet said that the barefoot, destitute Bedouin will start competing in building tall buildings. So that's what everyone remembers that, because it seems to be happening today. Kind of the ridiculous architectural projects in the Gulf and it seems to be, some say, a kind of fulfillment of this hadith. But the first part of the hadith, when he's asked what is Islam, he doesn't say, oh, these root letters are sin, lam, and mim, and it has this semantic field. He gives a practical definition, and this was the character of the Prophet. He'd give people practical advice as to what they could use in their everyday lives, and give people, sometimes give a different answer to a different person according to what that person needed to know. So if someone asked him, give me some advice, or give me the most important bit of advice, he'd often tailor it to that person. So this, when he's asked what is Islam, he just mentions the 5 pillars. He says Islam is to declare that there is only one God, or there is nothing worthy of worship but God, and Muhammad is his messenger, to pray 5 times a day, to pay the zakah, the compulsory charity that has to be paid to the poor, to fast in Ramadan, and to make the pilgrimage to the house, or to make the pilgrimage to the house in Mecca if one's able to do so. So he defined it as these 5 pillars, so that's a good way probably of introducing ourselves to Islam, or reminding ourselves, as sort of many people here already know the 5 pillars. And I just wanted to reflect for a little bit on each of these 5 pillars, and probably go off on tangents, but feel free to ask me questions afterwards when we actually finish. So the declaration of faith, is La ilaha illallah, Muhammad Rasulullah. People translate it in different ways, but essentially it means there is nothing worthy of worship but God, Allah, and Muhammad is his messenger. And in Arabic it looks something like that faded coin there. Does anyone know where that coin's from? A famous coin. Oh, it's not even you, but huh? No, it's not from Saudi Arabia. Saudi flag. That coin, believe it or not, is the coin of the Anglo-Saxon King Offa, who ruled in the 8th century. And we still to this day don't know why the Shahada, the Declaration of Faith, the Islamic Declaration of Faith, has been written inscribed on the other side of the coin. On the other side, the opposite side, is Offa Rex, King Offa. But on this side, you have this, and yes, we could say he was Muslim, probably wasn't, and it may be related to, they were imitating the golden dinars that were prevalent in the Islamic Empire, which was the powerful trading bloc at that time, and maybe that's why this was sort of imprinted on the other side, the other side there. So La ilaha illallah, it's a slightly sort of odd way of phrasing it, La ilaha illallah, rather than just you should worship God, or there is only one God, or God is one. It's La ilaha, it starts with a complete negation, and then with an exception, illallah. And to this day, Arab grammarians dispute as to what kind of istithna, for those who are studying Arabic, what kind of exception is grammatically, it's hard to understand this sentence. It's a sort of unique sentence, and it doesn't seem to follow the normal rules of how you make an exception in Arabic. But that's for the grammarians to discuss. For anyone who understands Arabic, the meaning is clear. It just means that there is nothing to be worshipped. There are no gods, no deities, no idols, no objects worthy of worship except for the one God. So it starts with a denial, a negation. You deny any deity, any superstitions, believing that, as people believe that the sun had sort of power over creation, and or the stars, or certain idols, or just any belief that there's multiple independent powers in the universe. There is only one sole power, sole independent power, whose existence isn't contingent on the existence of anything else in the universe, rather than multiple independent powers. So the Quran is often talking about not associating partners with God, not believing in many gods, and that this flies in the face of the order we observe around us. So today, with our technological achievements, we're able to appreciate this perhaps much more than they could 1400 years ago, that the order of creation, the fact that everything boils down to a few fundamental laws of physics and nothing seems to violate that, is a kind of evidence that there aren't multiple independent sort of powers making their own laws in existence. And as God says in the Quran, on the time of the Prophet Joseph, are many gods differing better, or God, the one, the irresistible, the one God? And if there were many gods, then they would mutually limit each other. You can't say that there's one all-powerful God. If you believe God is by definition all-powerful, if you have many gods with independent wills, they have to limit each other. So that's the first bit. La ilaha illallah, except for the one true unseen God, the one true divinity behind the one power behind creation, the one nurturing creation and taking it to its conclusion, except for that God. And I'll just put here that it's not inconsistent with a scientific worldview. It's common amongst, probably more common amongst the scientifically illiterate, you could say, say that science has sort of disproved God, that, you can't be a scientist and someone who believes in God at the same time, and science has given us a nice explanation for how the universe can work without a God. But actually, it's not so clear, as anyone who's involved in science should know. Science can't really prove or disprove God. And actually, there are many scientists who talk about the fundamental laws of physics having constants that are so precise, if you take them together to 1 in 1 part in 10 to the power 60, some unimaginably precise degree, as if they've been fine-tuned, because had they been different by that small amount, then life as we know it wouldn't have been possible. And they can't actually explain why the laws of physics should have those constants. And they call it, Paul Davies has called it the Goldilocks enigma. So, Goldilocks, 3 bears, she came to the house and Daddy Bear's porridge was too hot, and Mummy Bear's porridge was too cold, Baby Bear's porridge was just right. Everything that Baby Bear had. It should be called the Baby Bear enigma, probably not the Goldilocks enigma. Goldilocks would be a bit more glamorous, but why is everything in the universe just right so that creation or life as we know it could have emerged? Everything seems to be just right. It didn't have to be that way. And so some of them point to some fine-tuning. So the point here is that it's not inconsistent with the scientific worldview to believe that there is an intelligence behind creation. And amongst the books some of you might have read, the Jackie Collins of science writing, that's a bit sort of facetious, sorry, he's a very good writer. Richard Dawkins in his God Delusion talks about this problem. So he starts, towards the start of his book, he's talking about how religion is always a cop-out explanation, whereas scientists try to explain how things emerge with reference to laws of physics and natural phenomena. For religionists, it's easy. Oh, God did that. God did that. God. It's a cop-out explanation. You don't have to probe further, because as soon as you introduce God, then anything, no matter how improbable, if God willed it, it could have happened. But actually, that's not the way Muslim scientists have worked. We can say that the Renaissance was kick-started by what was happening centuries earlier in the Muslim world. Muslim scientists didn't stop at, yes, God. They believed in God, but yet they still pioneered the scientific method. They gave us everything that we have today before the Renaissance, so it didn't really limit them. And then later in the book, he talks about this problem of why is everything just right? And his explanation is the multiverse. There may not be just one universe, but there could be an infinite number of universes, or 10 to the power 60 universes, and we just happen to be in the one. In fact, we had to be in that one because we couldn't merge in any of the other ones. That got everything just right, which could be true, but the point is there's no independent evidence for it. So it's just like, it's the same cop-out explanation. So anything you say, how could that happen? It's got a 1 in 100 chance of happening. Well, if you believe there are 100 universes, then this is the one where it happened. You can explain anything that way. It's actually worse than the religious cop-out explanation. Anyway, so there may be many universes, and we believe that God created them too. And then I even go further to say, sometimes the way in which science operates is kind of fundamentally monotheistic. Depends how you define monotheism. But why should there be only one set of laws behind everything that we observe? Why is scientists are we all constantly trying to boil things down to very few laws? And if we can get one equation, we'd be really happy. A theory of everything, an equation that explains everything. When they link two fundamental forces, it's a great achievement. And if you link them all to one, that would be a great achievement. It's kind of, religionists might say, it's part of this yearning, this inner knowledge that we have, that there is only one force behind creation, so everything should boil down to one ultimate reality. And it's interesting, because if you look at the debates in the Middle Ages between Islamic scholars and sort of philosophers, in the Middle Ages, often the philosophers were saying that the universe is eternal, there wasn't a moment of creation, God didn't create it, it was just eternal, whereas the theologians were saying, well, actually we do believe there was a point of creation. And now you have the Big Bang Theory and many pointers suggesting that there was a singular moment of creation, whether that was it or not. One doesn't have to take a stance on that. But again, it actually fits in with, rather than the Big Bang explaining away God, actually it shows that those theologians were probably right, rather than the philosophers who just had it as a basic assumption that the universe as it is was unchanging and eternal. Okay, so La ilaha illallah, it's like an uncompromising monotheism. We believe that there is only one God. We were created to know God, and this is the true way to achieve fulfillment in life, as God says in the Quran. Only in the remembrance of God do hearts find rest. You won't find rest in material possessions, in all sorts of pleasurable activities. Ultimately, you're created in such a way that your heart will only find true rest in the remembrance of God. And this God is an unseen God, not like anything we know. The famous chapter in the Quran, Allah Attihad say God is one. Allah Samad, the eternal, the absolute, the one on whom everything depends, who is dependent on nothing. Lam yalid wa lam yulad, he neither begets nor was he begotten. Wa lam yakun lahu kufuwan ahad, and there is nothing like him. And elsewhere, laysa kamithlihi shay' wa huwa as-sami'ul basir. There is nothing like him, and he is the all-hearing, the all-knowing. So the Islamic view of God isn't that he's a man or some kind of limited view of God. It's that God is unseen, the same God who is there all the time, and whatever you imagine God to be like, he's different from that. Laysa kamithlihi shay'. We say he because of the limited language, but we don't even believe God is male or female. God is unique. And we take the commandment seriously that you don't even take a graven image. So when we take visitors around the mosque, one thing that they often comment on, if you've been to any mosque, that the one distinguishing feature between a mosque and other places of worship are the absence of representational arts, and no statues of people or animals, no even pictures of people or animals. It's because of the seriousness that you only focus on God. You don't make any representations of God in your place of worship. You shouldn't have things that would distract you from focusing on God, focusing on the unseen God. So that's the reason for it, and often people then criticize Islam as that this is a kind of yet another example of the barbaric Islamic restriction of artistic freedom, that you can't even make statues and things. You can, or dolls. Our kids can't have dolls. I heard someone say, actually Muslim scholars have allowed dolls. Prophets, family had dolls, that's okay, but it's big kind of images that are objects of worship in the mosques are not allowed. But even a cursory look at Islamic art and architecture just shows that there was that restriction in inverted commas of artistic freedom actually led to great developments in calligraphy and in geometry and architecture. So if you have any postcard of Jerusalem, you'll see the kind of defining feature is that dome of the rock. You look at it a little bit closer, and you see wonderful calligraphy, wonderful geometry and architecture. So this restriction, and there's a whole argument that can be made that more productive things can be achieved with a few constraints than could be achieved if there were no constraints at all. And then here's some more examples. I think that's mosque in Turkey. That's the calligraphy we were talking about. Gratuitous, nice pictures here. Mosque in Morocco, I think. And actually just not gratuitous, nice pictures, but they pushed it to such a level that they managed to get a degree of geometry that we find difficult to explain. So certain mathematicians will know this better than I do, but certain quasi-crystalline Penrose patterns that were thought to only have been discovered this century or last century, you have now found, this interesting paper a few years ago, showed that you can actually find examples of that in Islamic art or Islamic tiles. So that's an example. And at the moment they're trying to sort of explain how they developed such a complicated geometry. Okay, the second part of the declaration, Muhammad is the messenger of God. So we believe in God, so many Muslim scholars would say it's a logical conclusion. If anyone was left on their own, they would ultimately come to the conclusion that there is an ultimate reality, a divinity behind creation, only one being worthy of their worship, and may come to some conclusions about what this being might be like, but you can only get so far. You can say, well, yes, I should perhaps lead a good life, this is a good being, I see a lot of good things around me, but you can exert yourself as much as you can, but in terms of living the best life, or a fruitful life, and the best, most just laws for society and how to live in human relationships, you can only get so far, and someone else might differ with you, and then how would you arbitrate? You could go with the majority, is the majority always correct? And this isn't saying that Islam is against democracy, these are just talking about the spiritual dimension and religious guidance primarily, but to actually know how we should approach God, we need revelation. So Muslims believe God sent prophets throughout the ages, and Muhammad is the final. So this is the second part of the declaration of faith, Muhammad Rasulullah. Muhammad is the final in that line of messengers. And because it was going to be the final message, no prophets to come after Muhammad, it had to be preserved. So Muslims believe that Jesus came with the word of God, Moses came with the word of God, David came with the word of God. All of these prophets were sent by God, and many that we don't know about. Every nation had a prophet. But what they brought wasn't always preserved. In fact, it's a fact. You can see many different sort of contradictory versions of the New Testament or the Old Testament. We know that it can't be verbatim what he said, because it contradicts. There are contradictions between the different versions. They were written several centuries later. There are lots of interesting theories as to how the writing came about, and bits of the Old Testament were dovetailed. So bits were added, forgotten, deleted, changed intentionally, unintentionally, but God sent prophets throughout history. The final prophet came with a promise that his revelation would be preserved. You don't need to be a Muslim to believe that. There's a consensus that the Quran is the same Quran as the Prophet Muhammad brought. And the second source of Islamic law, which is the Sunnah, the example of the Prophet, the primary way of interpreting the Quran, has also been preserved. The Quran, we know, has been preserved verbatim. You take the Quran from any part of the Muslim world, you find it's the same, with sort of minor differences in pronunciation or minor accepted differences in the way you recite it, but the text is essentially the same, and it's essentially the same as those first manuscripts we have from a few years after the death of the Prophet Muhammad. The Hadith, the Sunnah, the example of the Prophet Muhammad, God in his wisdom chose to preserve that by means of the human ingenuity with which he created. So it's not preserved between the covers of one book as the Quran is, but the Sunnah has been preserved by scholars from the early generations after the Prophet Muhammad, who collected this vast corpus of hadith, people saying the Prophet said such and such happened in the Prophet's presence, the Prophet got up and did such and such, and then teased out which of those narrations were authentic from the vast amount that were inauthentic or misremembered. And this is actually a distinguishing feature of Islamic scholarship, Islamic hadith scholarship, which doesn't really have any parallel in any other civilization. This science of hadith criticism, this intense scrutiny and rigorous kind of academic approach to analysing the hadith and making sure if anyone said that the Prophet said something, he had to provide a chain of narration between himself or herself and the Prophet Muhammad. That chain had to be connected. You had to analyse everyone in the chain. Did he or she really meet that person? Where did they live? Did they really have good character? Might they have just invented something? Did they have a good memory? They might have had good character but bad memories and just forgotten what they were, what they were narrating or misremembered it. And to such a degree that books upon books and books of biographies, they call it ilm al-rijal, the science of men. It's actually science of men and women, but this was the knowledge of the biographies of all of these thousands and thousands of narrators, so that you could check whether this narration from the Prophet was actually authentic. And even in the time, there are reports of how they would go back and test those people whom they narrated from to make sure that you really are narrating the right thing. There's Ahmad ibn Hanbal, who many people have heard of, one of the great scholars of the past, apart from many other things. He was a great hadith narrator and collector. And Yahya ibn Ma'in, his friend, who was a great muhaddith, there's a beautiful story which I like. They go back to someone they narrated from about a year or so ago, and Yahya ibn Ma'in says, why don't we go in and just ask him about those hadith he narrated, just to check that he got them right. And Ahmad ibn Hanbal knows the person, so we don't need to do that because I know that this person is a reliable narrator. I know he doesn't make mistakes. And Yahya said, no, I want to go in. So they go in, they ask the person welcomes them, they sit with him, and Yahya then asks him, a year ago, whenever ago, you narrated this to us, and he intentionally puts in a small, subtle mistake. Is that what you narrated to us? And then the man replies, no, and then he gives them the correct narration of what he actually said, and then Yahya does it again with another narration with a subtle mistake, and does it again. And then after about 3 attempts, the man realizes the scholar realizes what's going on, and he punches Yahya in the chest and throws him out the can't there is something like, he says, Ahmad ibn Hanbal's too pious to do something like this. As for you, I can see what you're doing, and he throws them out. So they go out, and Ahmad says to Yahya, didn't I tell you that he was reliable, and now you got punched as well, and we got thrown out. And Yahya said, him punching me in my chest is more beloved to me than anything, because now I'm convinced that he's a reliable narrator. So these are the kind of things they do to make sure it's not just some fantasy we have that, oh yes, everything's correct. It's actually, these are verifiable. As a scientist, I kind of like it, because one of the features of the scientific method is everything's verifiable. Everything, I show something, it's not enough for me, so I did an experiment and it showed this, that's it. I have to explain how I did it, what my methods were, so that you could repeat that experiment and get the same result, or test it with a different experiment to see if that hypothesis is correct. So one of the main features of the scientific method is it's verifiable. And this is an early example, so it wasn't enough for them just to narrate a hadith. They would give the chain of narration so that those coming after them could verify, and people are doing it to this day, looking at all of the chains of narrations and trying to verify, well, is that person, did he really live at that time, he or she? And I put female scholarship there as well, because there are thousands upon thousands of female narrators as well. We often talk about there not being any female scholars in Islam, actually, not just Aisha, the wife of the Prophet, but generations upon generations after them. Sorry?
Not a single one has ever been found to narrate a false narrative.
Okay, that's very interesting. Yeah, so you'll see in them big criticism for that. So-and-so is a liar, so-and-so just makes up hadith, so-and-so had a bad memory but when they wrote from their books, but then their house burnt down in such and such year, so if anything's narrated after this time, you don't trust it because, yeah, interestingly, the female narrators of hadith tend not to have had any questions. That's from a different talk I gave, but it's just showing, so Abraham is a patriarch. From Abraham and Sarah descended the tribes of Israel, Isaac, Jacob, also called Israel, so you have those prophets mentioned in the Quran. But from Ishmael, who was from the union of Abraham and Hajar, who Abraham settled them in Mecca, originally called Becca. From his line came only one prophet that we know of, that was the Prophet Muhammad. And scholars have often talked about how it was from the union of not just two Hebrews, but a Hebrew and a Gentile, in inverted commas, and an Egyptian. We love Egypt. May God help them and give them something better than they had before. Yeah, so from that line came the universal prophet, who was to be the prophet to all of humanity, whose message was to be preserved. That's the city of Medina, the city of the Prophet Muhammad, where he went to from Mecca. That green dome there is, just see it, is over the place where the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, was buried. That's it, close up. And Muslims see him as, so we have a preserved example of his life and his companions, and Muslims see them as the paragon of virtue, the way to live the good life, the way to approach God, to interpret the Quran. And just, if anyone sort of reads about the life of the Prophet from authentic sources, you get the impression of an amazing person with incredible compassion and mercy, sent, as God says, as a mercy to the world. And Muslims from a young age will grow to love the Prophet. So this sort of explains why they react kind of negatively when people just are happy with intellectual debate, but if someone just randomly does a disparaging cartoon or disparagingly vilifies the Prophet or his family, we get a little bit upset. Oh, that's an interesting book if anyone's interested in female scholarship in Islam. Muhammad al-Nadawi is an Indian scholar now based in Oxford, who has been through, he's actually written a 40-volume work in Arabic, going through over 8,000 biographies of female narrators of hadith. And the introduction has been abridged and translated into English, and that's Hadith, the Women Scholars in Islam, which is a brilliant book. Quite enlightening. Okay, so I'll now go quickly through the other pillars. It takes too long. So the second pillar, that was the declaration of faith, the canonical prayer, the salah. Salah is thought to come from the same root as sila, which means a connection between two people. There's a sila, so salah is your link with God, the 5 times daily prayer. And again, it's a prayer in the way the Prophet Muhammad's example has been preserved, so it's as the prophets prayed. Even in the Bible, we'll see incidents where Moses fell on his face or Abraham fell on his face, meaning they prostrated to God, much in the way that Muslims pray today. It's the single most universally recognized form of worship. You'll see it anywhere, wherever you are in a mosque. In some other country, you don't speak the language of the people, you don't know what's going on, but as soon as you enter and they're praying, you know exactly what to do. And in fact, if the imam's not there, I've actually been at mosque in other countries where they just push me to lead the prayer because I look like I've got a beard and I might know what I'm doing. So literally, I don't speak their language, but you can do the prayer because it's the same thing, the same way that the Prophet Muhammad prayed. People are asking, why isn't it just a prayer of the heart? Why this funny kind of, all of these actions in the prayer? We say it's because of the way the Prophet Muhammad did it, so it's the best way to do it. The one who was chosen by God, and that's the way to imitate. But also, you can even think logically that there's a certain, as well as the mind affecting the body affects the mind. So if you're in a certain, it's been shown, there's this thing called situated cognition, it's been shown by psychologists that your situation, the way you're sitting, the way you're standing, can affect the way you respond to certain situations. There's an interesting bit of research where, not going on too many tangents, but where it's been shown that you get less angry if you're sitting than when you're standing. So they've got people to write the opinion pieces, and then they got someone else who was meant to be unbiased, but to just disparage it, and they found that the parts of the brain, by scanning that were associated with intense emotions, specifically anger, were much more active in those who were standing up than those who were sitting down. It sort of fits with the prophetic advice where the Prophet Muhammad said, if you're angry, then sit. If you're standing, then sit down, and if you're sitting and angry, then lie down, and if you're still angry, then go into a blue, go wash yourself. So just having your forehead on the ground, you may be the most arrogant person there is. Be an arrogant surgeon, and surgeons often are. But if you're forced to go into that position, you really understand what you're doing, then you have a certain humility. You can't fail to develop a certain humility if you understand it. If you're not just doing it as a habit, you were brought up to do certain things, but if you understand what you're doing, putting your forehead on the ground before God, it gives you that humility. Lots of other things I don't have time to mention, or we can talk about maybe questions or something. Praying 5 times a day. Some scholars have commented on the fact that because it's a prayer 5 times a day, it goes with the movements of the sun. So in the winter, the prayers are quite close together. In the summer, they're quite far apart. And it orientates you in natural time and space. You're orientated in natural time rather than just sort of artificial 24-hour clock. Muslims, especially in Ramadan, can tell you when the sun sets to the minute because they're so aware, because they're going to break their fast that time, or even the rest of the year there's a prayer at that time. So Muslims should be orientated in natural time and natural space. So traditionally, if you ask in any sort of village throughout the world, which way is north, which way is south, they'd be able to tell you. But here, if you're standing in the middle of Cambridge, or if you've got a map in your mind, you'd be hard pushed to say which way north or south was. If a Muslim prayed anywhere, then they already know which way southeast is because they pray towards Mecca. So again, it's just that awareness of your natural environment rather than your built-up artificial environment. Some people have gone further and said that should engender a kind of respect for the environment, a kind of harmony in the environment. The Muslim teaching is we're not here to exploit the environment, but to live in harmony with it. The Quran is possibly the scripture that's most conscious of nature more than any other scripture, and we can see the catastrophic consequences of ignoring the natural environment. Another objection, often people say, well, why do I have to pray at least 5 times, just forcing me to come out and pray at this time? Why can't I just pray when I want to pray? If I feel like praying, I'm going to pray a much better prayer. And that's true, and Islam doesn't stop anyone praying. There's the optional prayer in the middle of the night, or any time during the day if someone feels like praying, you pray. But the praying at certain times, the response would be sometimes the times when you don't feel like praying are the times when you most need to pray. So the times when you're not thinking about God, you're up to all sorts of mischief. Maybe that's the best time for you to be pulled literally by the scruff of your neck. Literally, metaphorically by the scruff of your neck, but you have to pray, think of God, think about what you're doing, and it's a kind of gentle reminder 5 times a day, every day, rather than once a year, once a week, but 5 times every day, not taking very long. But that's, in case you've never seen a Muslim pray, that was actually in a medical journal, believe it or not, talking about a guy with ankylosing spondylitis, a severe type of arthritis, who had all the conventional treatments, and then Ramadan came, and he happened to be a Muslim, and he went through Taraweeh prayer, the 2 hours every night, and he had objective improvements in all of his sort of scores. So that's interesting. It's like an anecdotal thing, but I thought I'd put it up there. You don't often see that in a journal. So Muslims can pray anywhere. I think that's a place that was destroyed by the earthquake in Pakistan. Praying in the direction of Mecca. This is the Kaaba in Mecca, what we believe is the place where the first house of God, built by Abraham and his son Ishmael, rebuilt several times since, but on the same site. That's the focus. Muslims aren't praying to the house, but they're praying in that direction as the focus for worshiping God. Let's do a wider angle shot where you can see how many. So during the Hajj time, you literally get 2.5 million people there. Probably about 1 million accommodating in the mosque and the rest are outside. And you can often think of it as sort of concentric circles around the Valley of Mecca, or Mecca as it was called before. Muslims are praying wherever they are, they're praying in that direction. So you've got concentric circles all through the earth, praying towards Mecca. It's a kind of focal point. We know the earth's actually a sphere, so you could also imagine it as just 5 slivers of the earth at any time praying to God. And as the earth rotates, these sort of segments are rotating around the earth as the prayer times come and go. And Muslims see it as a kind of fulfillment of the prophets saying that the whole earth would be made a place of prayer. Why have we got that there? Oh yeah, I often talk, when I'm talking about face washing and preparing for the prayer, that as an eye doctor, I'm quite interested in trachoma, which is the biggest cause of irreversible blindness worldwide. And one of the WHO strategies to cope with it is just face washing. We've got a safe strategy. The F in it is face washing. It's been shown that if you wash your face just 3 times a day or more, we did it it was in Sudan, you were 60% less likely to, at that point before there, to develop trachoma. That's a bit of a trend there. Obviously not why we do it. Okay, and then the 4th pillar is compulsory charity, paying part of your income for anyone who has more than enough for themselves and their family has to pay a certain amount, 2.5% in most cases, to the poor. If you pay more, that's encouraged, it's called sadaqah, but this minimal amount you have to pay, and it's regarded as the right of the poor. And Islam has a lot in terms of teaching about a just economic system. It prohibits interest. Famously, Christianity did that as well originally, but no longer, sadly. Islam did and does, and Muslims are trying to go back towards a more Islamic financial system. And I think Taoism is probably the only religion that prohibits interest. But if we're serious about eliminating world poverty, and I recommend a book by Peter Singer called The Life You Can Save, Ending Child Poverty or something. Brilliant book. But even he misses one point, which is actually, as long as you have interest and interest-based financial systems and fractional reserve banking, you can never eliminate poverty completely. Not even in this country, no, the rest of the world, and this is just a few figures. The point of this is basically the developing world has already paid back to the developed world the amount it borrowed in loans, and the reason it's still, much of that world is in poverty is because they're paying the interest on those loans, and that's why they have to use the land to grow cash crops and not food to feed their people. The only other thing I'd say is that Larry Hannigan, there's an article that he wrote in 1971 called The Earth Plus 5%. It's a brilliant expose of just the way fractional reserve banking works, what the banks do. It's sort of simplified. It's got this guy called Fabian who develops this horrible system, but it's literally what the banks do and why any sort of system that's based on modern banking will inevitably create poverty and never end debt, because as long as you've got a rate of interest there, you end up with having the earth plus 5%. You have more debt than there is wealth available, which is why people end up constantly in debt. Larry Hannigan, the earth plus 5%. Okay, fasting in Ramadan, so that was the third pillar. Fourth pillar, fasting in Ramadan. Many people, everyone knows that Muslims fast in Ramadan, the 9th month of the Islamic calendar. You abstain from eating, drinking, intimate relations between dawn and sunset, and it's to the God says it's there to make you aware of God. It counters this materialistic view. So the atheists will tell us that or some scientists tell us we're only here to eat, drink, and procreate. We have no other purpose in our lives. In fact, we're just here to procreate and eat and drink so that we can procreate. God sort of forbids you from doing those three very things during the daylight hours of the month of Ramadan, again, just to grab you and think, well, there may be a greater purpose to your creation. Lunar months, I won't talk much about that, but obviously remembering the poor, we can often go through our lives, not if we live in a relatively affluent society, never feeling real hunger, whereas if you're fasting the long days of a summer Ramadan, you do feel something of the hunger and thirst that maybe those who aren't fasting voluntarily are feeling, and it encourages you. And the vast sums that are given to the poor in Ramadan from Muslim countries and raised in mosques are a testament to this. Okay, the final one is the pilgrimage to Mecca. Every Muslim who can do so, can afford to do so, needs to make a pilgrimage in at least once in their life to Mecca, to the place where the Kaaba is, where Abraham settled his son Ishmael, and where the well of Zamzam came. And it's actually referred to in the Bible, interestingly enough, in the Psalm, "Blessed is he whose strength is in thee, and in whose heart are the ways of those passing through Mecca made it a well." So it was something known even to the children of Israel at that time, but later became forgotten. So this, when one goes there, it's regarded as the centre. One remembers the sacrifice of Abraham and Hajar. And one of the big lessons that I found, and many people find who go there, is you suddenly see the equality of humanity. People from all parts of the world, every single complexion, any place you've heard of, any place you haven't heard of, they're all there doing the same thing. All of the men are wearing exactly the same, just two pieces of white, one from the top half of the body, one from the bottom half of the body. You can't tell how rich someone is, you can't tell, how poor they are or anything about them, and everyone's there doing the same thing. So people who go there one of the lessons of that is you realise that we're all equal. And Malcolm X, who many of you will have heard of, famously went, and before he went, he grew up in racist America, and he came to the conclusion that the black man was inherently good and the white man was inherently evil. The white man was the devil. So this was the teaching of something called the Nation of Islam, which actually had nothing to do with Islam. They believed God came down as a man and lots of other things, apart from the racism, which aren't really compatible with Islam. But then when he went on the pilgrimage to Mecca, he suddenly was gobsmacked by all of the kind of white Muslims from Bosnia, from the Caucasus, doing exactly the same thing. And it's the first time he saw true brotherhood of humanity. So I won't read it all out, but just the last thing. I've eaten from the same glass and slept in the same bed on the same rug, while praying to the same God with fellow Muslims whose eyes were the bluest of blue, whose hair was the blondest of blonde, and whose skin was the whitest of white. And in the words and the actions and in the deeds of the white Muslims, I felt the same sincerity that I felt among the black African Muslims of Nigeria, Sudan, and Ghana. So in that letter he wrote back from that had shocked America, because he was known as the angriest black man in America. He completely changed and then started to preach a message of conciliation and tolerance. Unfortunately, he was assassinated, I think, within a year of his return from the pilgrimage. So those are the 5 pillars, and it's our belief that someone who really observes those 5 pillars of this religion properly, not just in a kind of superficial way, but understands what they're about, will be a wonderful human being bringing light to themselves and others. And it's not something that someone could have worked out, but we believe that this is a revelation from God and a manifestation of God's mercy. So there's a verse in the Quran, "We did not send you," talking to Muhammad, "peace be upon him, except as a mercy to the world," and this is a manifestation of that mercy. Okay. I'll now shut the heck up, and I've shown too long, so I'll leave it to you. I don't have any questions afterwards.
Can you guys see me, or should I get a phone book? Phone book? I'll stand on the side and then you can see me. I'm sorry I have to show cold, so it's going to sound a little congested. And I apologize, we had to bring our kids, which means that we had to bribe them with crisps, so that's what you heard from the front desk. So, Omar actually pretty much said it all. And my tangents won't be nearly as interesting as his. But what he's covered is the 5 pillars of Islam. So if you were kind of looking at Islam, if you were going to think of an analogy, it would be like, there was a house, right? If the whole religion was a house, the 5 pillars are the structure of the house. And what I'm going to cover, this is 6 articles of faith, or what we call Iman in the Bible, is kind of like making your house a home. So it's the light, the warmth that comes from your house. It's like, you know, the nice furnishings you have. It's what makes it cozy, what makes it yours, what makes it comfortable. So again, so it's really, these are 6 beliefs. So it's not nearly as complex as, for example, theology in many of the other religions. It's really quite simple. There's 6 tenets of belief that you must believe in for your faith to be complete. And when I mean faith here, I'm not just talking about Iman in Arabic says much more than the word faith in English, as we understand it in our kind of common day dialect. It's not just the intellectual knowledge of something, it's not just the intellectual knowledge of knowing something, but the spiritual feeling that comes with it. So that intrinsic kind of, yes, I believe it, even if I don't quite understand it, I've understood it at a level of my heart kind of thing. So it's much more spiritual than it is just kind of like intellectual. So if we say, for example, that something is infinite in mathematics, then you're like, okay, infinite, no beginning, no end, right? But if you sit there and you think about what infinite means, right, and you have kind of if you say God is infinite, so if you have kind of that knowledge that there's no beginning, there's no end, there's no God was not created, there's no kind of outside time, which is kind of outside our, you know, thought, our constraints, right? Because we operate in time. We're 4-dimensional creatures. We operate in time. It's internalizing all of that basically. So it's not just the intellectual knowledge. That's kind of the point I wanted to start with. It's much more beyond that. And in the Quran, it's recognized that Iman, or faith, is something that fluctuates. It's not, you know, it's not like, okay, you've got it, boom, you're done, that's it, it's over. You're good for life, you're done. No, it's something that goes up and down, and it's something that you need to strive and struggle and, you know, make great efforts through reflection and through action and through thought to maintain, right? So there's times in which your faith will be really low, and there's times when you'll be like, whoo, you know, way up in the clouds. So to maintain that, you need to be a person who thinks, a person who reflects on a lot of things that happen in your life and in the lives of people around you, but not just to kind of think about it and go, okay, I got it, but you need to act upon it. So if you are just thinking about problems and you're not offering solutions to those problems, that's like just kind of a dead faith. Like you're just having a dead faith. It's just dry, it's like dry toast, right? If you want, sorry, dry toast. I'm hungry, I'm pregnant. Anyways, it's not just, you don't want dry toast, you want something on the toast, you want faith and action, you want both, right? You want the belief that something is right, and you want somebody to follow up on that to make it come into reality, right? So that's what it means to have faith, to have iman. So there's Islam, and then there's iman. So I'll go through the 6 heads. I'm sorry, Omar's like way ahead of the game. He's got the PowerPoint, he's got the pictures, he's got the great tangents and medical journals. I've got a pen and paper. You can't even look at anything, so I'll just let you look at this picture. So the first belief is the belief in God. So we've already Omar's covered pretty much most of that. The only thing I'll add to that really is the belief that he's already mentioned, it's uncompromising and monotheistic. Nothing to be worshipped other than God. And in our kind of modern thing, we get worship. What do you mean worship? Like, okay, I don't worship, I don't worship statues, and I don't worship, a God that I have carved in a stone or something like this. But what we're talking about maybe here is people who worship money, right? So it's not quite as obvious. It's much more subtle, right? So people who just run their whole lives just running after money, running after money, running after money, right? That's a form of worship because they think that money is just more important than everything else, and they've placed it at a status and they've prioritized it as the thing that they want. I'm going to do this and do this and do this to make money, right? And I'm going to abuse this person and step on this person and kill that person to make money, right? It's money, or it's power, or it's any other thing. So the only thing I'll add to Omar's bit is that Allah is not it's not like a different name of a different God. Allah means the God. Al in Arabic is the, and La is God. So my last name is Elgazzar, the butcher. Sorry. Our family is actually a family of bakers. You'll be happy to know. But Al in Arabic is the article the. Now, when you're talking about it in the word Allah, Allah is in absolute bars, absolute value bars. So those of you who remember way back in like grade 9 finite class or whatever you had, absolute value bars, and that it never changes. It's always constant. The God. There's no other. That's it. Allah. That's kind of what it means. When you kind of translate it all from language, some things are just kind of lost in translation. So, okay, so I'm not going to go back and mention everything over again. The only thing I'll add is kind of like a bit of a philosophical twist, is that when we say God is infinite, right, there are certain kind of other philosophies that will say God created the earth and then he just let it go. We don't believe that. So, God created the earth, and our creation is consistently sustained by him. And if he stopped, at any moment, we would vanish from existence. So it's not that God creates, it's not like deism, for example, where God creates something and then just lets it go. We are dependent on him for every single thing that we have, every single moment of our life, and every breath that we take, so on and so forth. He can choose to stop it at the drop of a pin. Be and it is, right? So kun fayakun, be and it is, right? So a little bit before Shakespeare's time. Okay. I don't want to repeat everything that Omar was saying, because Omar, mashallah, covered so much ground. So God is infinite and his attributes are infinite. That's the other thing I want to stress. So when we talk about his justice is infinite. It's in those absolute value bars. There's nothing that's going to take away from it or add to it. It's infinite. That he's all-knowing and all-hearing, all-seeing. He has so many attributes. There are 99 attributes that are there's more than that, but there's 99 that are outlined for us in Islamic creed. And that because it can get kind of overwhelming when you think someone is all-knowing. And when we say all-knowing, we're talking about every thought in your heart of every person that has ever lived since the beginning of time to the end of time. We're not talking about, okay, Hosni Mubarak's going down on February 11th, right? We're talking every little detail. And so if you think about that, it can kind of get mind-boggling. But because we are four-dimensional creatures, right, we don't have access to a lot of the other dimensions that God may have created. So it's not necessarily irrational to think that God has that kind of power, but it's supernatural. Because then it's beyond what we have access to, in a way. Okay. Second one. I won't go, that's the one I have the most for, so this will go quickly. His angels. So like all of the other religions, we have some central kind of angels that are that have been present throughout the Revelation. So the Archangel Gabriel and Michael in English, are both mentioned in the Quran by name. But it's not the same kind of imagery that we have kind of in the Western world. So we don't have like cute babies that are not dressed with wings, right? Or long, fair maidens with wings that are flying around. Those are not the angels. There is no kind of visual imagery that we have for angels. Exactly for the reason that Omar was mentioning, so that people don't worship angels, right? Because angels have no free will. And that's what another part of the belief is, that angels have no free will. They are commanded by God and they obey. Period. They are not, and just before, I know it's a problem, this might come up in questions, but the devil was not an angel, he was a jinn. Different. But anyway, so what this stresses, I think, is our belief in the unseen world. Okay? So that there is a world beyond our temporal, five senses, four-dimensional experience of life. That there is a whole world out there, and that it comprises of the angels who are there. And Muslims believe that, this is an example for you, that there are angels who record, and they sit upon your shoulders. So the angels are with us all the time. They sit on your shoulders, and the angel on the right side of your shoulder is the one who records your good deeds. And the angel on the left side of your shoulder is the one who records your bad deeds. And when you pass away, when you die, the pens are lifted and the ink will dry, right? So that's it. The record is closed, finished, right? And it's put away until you're called to account. Anyway, so that's just an example of kind of the angels that are there with us all the time. Okay, so 3, his books. So all of the Holy Scriptures are part of our belief system. So so not just the Quran, which is, we believe, preserved Word of God, but also the Gospels, the Torah, the Psalms, as Omar had quoted David's book. So they're all part of the same message. And that same message, we say, is like sila. They're all linked together. And they were sent to different people at different times to be appropriate for their circumstances, right? So appropriate people receive a message that was at their level, for their time, for their circumstances. And so each one of those links has the same kind of universal underlay, in that there's one God, and our purpose is to obey God and to worship God. So on and so forth. Same message, same God. Okay? It's not the God of the Jews, the God of the Christians, the God of the Buddhists, the God of this, the God of that. It's one God, only one. I think maybe what you could take away from all of this is that, like, the main belief, the heart of it all, is one God. Okay, and that the Quran has been preserved. That all of the messages transcend time, they transcend people, and they are universal. Okay? So his prophets. So it's not just La ilaha illallah, Muhammad Rasulullah. So it's not just we believe in one God and only one God, and Muhammad is his final messenger. That's the kind of the heart of it, but we believe in all of the messengers. So all the way from Adam until Muhammad, those are all messengers. So Abraham, Noah, Elijah, Lot. There's so many. Ismail, Ishaq, Job. There's Noah. Did I say Noah already? There's plenty, right? There's lots of them, and all of their stories. Many of them are mentioned. I think there's about 15 of them that are mentioned, or possibly a little bit more, in the Quran. Some of their stories are actually mentioned in great detail, like striking detail, unbelievable detail, and some of them are just kind of mentioned very quickly, and they're kind of they're exemplified. They're like, and the patience of Job, for example, and none was greater than Job at his time than him, right? He was the patient servant. But I think what's interesting is that you learn from each of the stories of the prophets. So if it's not mentioned in the Quran, sometimes, not for many of them, for many of the big ones anyways, for the ones that are most known, it's mentioned in the Hadith. It's mentioned in the prophetic traditions. You'll get the story of the prophets from there. And each one of them goes through a set of circumstances that is relevant, that stays forever relevant in your time. So you're thinking, right, okay, Moses and Pharaoh leading the children of Israel out of Egypt, right? That has no relevance now. But the Egyptians just finished kicking out a modern-day Pharaoh. I'm Egyptian. And they just finished kicking out, Egyptian too. Just finished kicking out a modern day pharaoh, someone who was as abusive and as arrogant and wouldn't step down and refused to hear the suffering of the people. So, and a lot of people were drawing parallels from that story. That story which doesn't even apply to Muslims, like those were the children of Israel, those were the Jews. And they were in Egypt. So it's that kind of sense of justice and that sense of striving, that sense of struggle is present in all of the stories, and it's something that is consistently relevant to our times, even if those stories were thousands and thousands of years ago. And that's why they're preserved in the Quran. That's why they're there, because they're constant reminders for us. So anyway, and they're all calling to the same God. So again, there's that universal message is at the base of all of it. Everybody calling in the same direction, calling to the same thing, to the same God, to the same worship, to the same God. Okay. I'm going really quickly because I want to give you guys enough time to ask questions, and that I hope you won't feel shy to ask all the questions, inshallah. So, number 5, the Day of Judgment. So, we said that God's attributes are in those absolute value bars. So, God is just. He is the just, right? And so we'll see injustice in our lives, and we'll see people who cheat and steal and lie and abuse and hurt and kill and so on and so forth. And it feels like they just live a life of luxury sometimes, right? Or they get away with it, almost feels like. But God is just. So what you don't get away with, what you do get away with here, you won't get away with when you're called to account, right? And that's kind of what is the balance for Muslims. So justice is in those absolute value bars, and nobody escapes that justice. Everybody will be called to account for what they did, what they said, and even for what you thought. So the example I want to give you here is, if, for example, I thought that I should slap this woman, and then I said, no, in my heart I said, no, that's wrong, right? God is aware of that thought. And when I'm called to account, He will say, you had a bad thought, and you suppressed it, and you stopped yourself from doing something that was inherently evil or not nice or so on and so forth, and you will be rewarded for having prevented yourself from doing it. Right? So we're talking about justice, like not just justice, like, okay, you killed someone, you paid the money, so on and so forth, or you served so many years in prison. We're talking about justice in its absolute sense. And that's what kind of drives, that's what should anyways, drive people to be upright and good, pious people. Because you know that at the end of the day, you're not just doing it because you're going to live and then you're going to die, but because you're going to be called to account. You're going to be asked to answer for everything that you've done, and everything that you said, and everything that you spent, and everything that you didn't spend, and everything that you didn't give, and everything even that you may have thought, right? So it's kind of like this God consciousness. The word in Arabic is taqwa. Is to always be aware that what you're doing is going to be, you're going to be called up for. Okay, so like I said, those angels, those recording angels that everybody has will bring up your books when you are called to account, and they'll be weighed on the scale. So this is the Day of Judgment. I won't go through the whole process of the Day of Judgment. But no one will escape this calling to account. And that's, I think, that's what restores the balance, if you will, in the world and in the afterlife. So people who will be punished will be punished, people who will be rewarded, except the people who will be punished and then be saved by their Lord through His mercy, but saved by God through His mercy. Because God is, that's the name that He most prefers to be called by, is Ar-Rahman, which means the merciful. And it's the kind of mercy that we don't have. It's the kind of mercy that is tempered with much more than justice. Because if you were merciful and you were just, you would only give mercy where it's deserved. But God will surpass that. And He will give mercy even when someone didn't earn it. Right? And many of us probably didn't earn it. I'll speak only for myself, I guess. Right? And that the afterlife is, that we believe in the afterlife, right? Which is eternal, which is infinite. In those value bars, as opposed to this world, which is ephemeral. Just tell. Okay, last one. Okay. Which is in Arabic called Al-Qada wal-Qadar. In English, that's called well, but it means literally, it means it's the measuring out, okay? But what you would translate it as is destiny or fate, in kind of common language. And it means but it literally means measuring out. And I'm going to use that because it's easier, it's better to explain what it really means. It's the measuring out of when and where and how long and in what conditions you will live, right? So you're going to be born on this day, at this hour, at this minute, at this second, and you will die at this date, at this hour, at this minute, at this second, and nothing you can do will change those dates, right? You'll be born to you'll be born to this kind of family, or you'll live in this part of the world, and you'll learn this, whatever. All of those things are preordained. It's destiny. But nothing happens without meaning, right? And then nothing happens without meaning. So that everything that you do has a meaning, or everything that you do has everything that happens has a meaning, and that nothing happens kind of by accident. That even if you don't see the wisdom behind it, or you don't understand the purposes behind it, that it all has, a wisdom behind it, and has effects, right? So everything that happens has an effect on something else, and that God is all aware and all wise, and I mean that in those absolute value bars, and that the contentment with God's will is part of that acceptance of destiny. So now what I know is, what I'm anticipating is, like, where does free will come in here? So free will is that you're still free to act, and you're still free to choose whatever it is that you want to do in life. And I think the balance, the easiest way for me to explain it, because this is just an introduction to Islam, but the easiest way for me to explain it is that, for example, if you have a bike, right, a bicycle, and you don't want it to be stolen, you're parking here in front of Keys College, and you don't want it to be stolen, you're not going to say, I trust in God. Right? You just leave your bike leaning against, destiny's destiny. You leave your bike leaning against the wall in a very visible place, and you're like, I trust in God, and you walk away, right, and then 2 seconds later someone comes and yanks your bike things off, right? No, you think, you prevent, you do everything that you can in which to stop those circumstances. But if some guy comes with hedge cutters and cuts your chain and takes your bike from behind 3 or 4 other bikes because you've stashed it really nicely behind so that it doesn't look nice and shiny for a thief, then at the end of that you would accept, you would say, okay, that's the destiny. Like, I wasn't meant to ride that bike. Like, you've tried everything, that's your free will. You've tried everything, you've done everything you're supposed to do, but if something still happened, then that would be the qada. So the will of God. And then you would be kind of like, okay, well, there's nothing I can do about it. That wasn't meant for me. Okay, and that's it. Okay, so I think I'll stop there, and then we can go to questions and answers. I think we have about 20 minutes. Yes, perfect.
Okay, thank you very much. So, we can move on to the question and answer session. Who would like to start with a question? Yes?
I have a question about the graven image.
Yeah.
Do you think it has a connection with, I think it's the first or second commandment of the Ten Commandments in the Old Testament?
Yeah.
You do?
Yes. So we believe it's we believe that Moses was a prophet of God, and the 10 Commandments that he was given
Right.
were relevant in our own.
Well, that's good. So that's enshrined in
Yes.
Muslim religion.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much.
I missed what you said about the devil and angel. So I just wanted to ask what you think about fate and kind of that idea. And also, what is the evidence you
Muslim view of evil. Okay, these are big philosophical questions. Okay, so the devil, a lot of people, I think in certain groups of Christian theology, they believe he was an angel. But Satan, as we have in the Quran, is a jinn. A jinn is a different kind of creature, so unseen to humans, but they also have free will. So they can choose to obey or to disobey. But Satan, prior to his fall from heaven, so to speak, was a very pious jinn. And he was amongst the ranks of the angels because he was so devout in his worship. And when God asked the angels to bow to Adam, and Satan was amongst their ranks, Satan said no, because he was arrogant, and he said, you created you created me from fire, and you created him from earth, from clay, dirt. So I'm better than him, why should I bow to him? And that was kind of like, it was the show of his arrogance, basically, the first sin ever. Because he wouldn't obey the commandment of God to bow to Adam. And so he fell from his standing, and then vowed to try and misguide any person who believed in God after that. And God gave him a prize for him. And then evil, concept of where, be a bit more specific. Where do you want me to start?
Because I would say the most, like, for example, in Christianity, evil is very connected to the fall and kind of, how Satan came down, everything is, it's very connected. So I was just trying to think, that doesn't seem to be so strong, Satan as a genie, and then that relates to evil and everything that happens because of Satan now. So yeah, that's just what I mean. Why do you think God is as it is, rather than what we should do?
I can start. That's not how you finish. Okay, that's a big one. So the concept of evil, I think, is kind of like a necessary to prove what is good. So you can't have light without darkness, darkness without light, so on and so forth. And that while the devil promotes evil, that if you choose to commit something, an evil act, that comes from you. It might be through the influence of the devil, but when you're called to account, for example, you'll say, "Oh, but I was told to do so," and the devil will say, "I was just influencing. You pulled the trigger. You did it." And so evil is kind of seen to come from following one's desires to the extent that they lose sight of the worship of God. So that they lose sight of where they are kind of in the spectrum, right? So if you're thinking of how small every human being is compared to the omnipotence of God, and you seem to think that you are better, or you have that arrogance, or you're striving for things that are not, I'm not going in the right direction, I don't think. Am I going in the right direction? You're following desires basically that are not, that are only going to fulfill your own sense of ego. And that's evil coming from within you. And then you have to counter that, right? And the devil is just kind of the one who kind of eggs you along, basically, who just kind of pushes things, so on and so forth. But at the end of the day, you are the one who's going to be punished. The devil has his own.
And also, so there's different views of evil, and some people have some religions have a kind of duality where God is battling against the devil. With Islam, as we believe in the destiny, God decides what happens. There's nothing that can limit God in any way. So if the devil exists and evil happens, God has allowed that to happen. There's no doubt about it. We don't believe that there's any kind of sort of struggle there. But sometimes for a wisdom that we can't comprehend, we're finite. God's wisdom is infinite, and we can't always comprehend the wisdom behind it. Sometimes we can, and there's scholars have written great lengths as to why. This perennial question of why is there suffering in the world, why is there evil in the world. There are lots of wisdoms one could fathom, but probably a lot that one couldn't fathom. So that's the first thing. So we believe God's allowed it for a reason. Some of the reasons are, you can either think about evil as the absence of good, so if good isn't there, you have evil, or you can think it's a way in which, as you said, so you can know good. So if you just had everything good, then you wouldn't know good. Like the colour red would have no meaning if everything was red. And what does red mean? It doesn't mean everything's red. So if you don't have suffering and evil, then you can never know good. You know things by their opposite. So that's one reason that it can be there. Another reason it's a necessary consequence of free will. So if God's testing you, then there has to be the evil choice as well. Or you can see the evil that results from others' actions, or the evil that results from not implementing God's guidance in having a just economic system, for example. So that the poverty is there for the one who really is serious about ending poverty, just needs to think about how about following God's guidance, and instead of railing against the barbaric Sharia, actually how about following those teachings that talk about economic justice. God's given us our free will. It's a test to do that, and you get unimaginable suffering if you don't follow it, but if you choose to follow it, then it's a kind of protection from that. So that's another thing some people have talked about. People talk about it as a purification, so people will have infinite, so the Prophet Muhammad was the best human being, yet he suffered a lot during his life, and you can't really say it was a punishment for something bad he'd done, because he really hasn't, and so many people suffer with that, but they will get much more than that in the next life, and it will be a purification for them, and this concept of the infinite recompense, so no matter how evil we think things are here, ultimately it's finite, it's going to be bound by that person's lifespan or the end of the world, whereas in the next life, believing in the Day of Judgment, you have infinite justice. So all of that which we perceive as evil will be, and is there for a certain wisdom that we may or may not fathom, on the Day of Judgment it will be sorted out, and those who have suffered will get their recompense.
Oh, sorry, somebody was on.
No, go ahead.
But just carrying on from the theme of evil. One thing that wasn't very clear to me about the Quran and Islam was the concept of redemption, because
Yes.
I've read it in a modern translation, but by an Islamic scholar,
Yeah.
and the whole of the Joseph story, I grew up in a Jewish family,
Right.
so I know the Old Testament part.
Yeah.
The whole of the Joseph story is more or less verbatim the Quran, but it misses out the bit where Joseph says to his brothers, don't worry, this was all intended, it's meant to be,
Yeah.
like you were saying about prophets, and good has come out of evil, like
Yeah.
9/11, there's always redemption,
Yeah.
certainly 9/11,
Yeah.
there's always redemption.
Yeah.
So how do you answer that concept of redemption?
So redemption and sort of repentance and that in general, and then the story of Joseph. It's actually a good point I forgot to mention. So our belief in the fall and in Adam and Eve disobeying God, and interestingly in the Quran it's Adam and Eve rather than Eve sort of misleading Adam. So the whole sort of rhetoric that kind of justified arguments against women, it's not there in the Quran. But they were then forgiven. So you achieve forgiveness and redemption by just asking God sincerely for forgiveness. And sincerely means sincerely. So we believe Adam and Eve were forgiven at that time, and their sin did not carry on. So we don't believe in original sin, and we don't believe that any child is born with the sin of its parents or anything like that.
Well, Jews don't believe it either.
Yeah.
Christians do
That's
it
right,
the
and
way
they do baptism, yeah, absolutely. And the story of Joseph, there is actually redemption at the end. So Joseph says famously to his brothers, "La tathriba alaykum al-yawm, yaghfir Allahu lakum wa huwa arhamur rahimin." So they realise how bad they've been, and he says to them, "There's no blame on you today. God will forgive you, and He is the best of the forgivers." So when they sincerely repent, and they say it's not Him forgiving them, but because they've sincerely realised the wrong of what they've done, we don't need a salvific sacrifice or God to come down, as Jews don't believe it. Christians believe sort of God coming down as a man to die for the sins of mankind. It's just your individual relationship with God, asking God sincerely for forgiveness. God will forgive you, but you have to be
Do you
sincere.
believe that, let's say, after 9/11, there's redemption?
For the people who did it,
For
or
the whole world, for the world.
Oh, I mean, in terms of things happening, yes, there's always wisdom behind it. So 9/11 didn't, as we say, God allows everything to happen. We don't believe that things happen and God's like, oh, I didn't mean for that to happen. Everything that happens, there is a wisdom behind it. We can't always fathom that wisdom. Some might say that, a lot of good did come out of it. In other ways, it was a horrendous act and horrendous suffering, but then what came after that maybe it actually caused more suffering. But in many ways, you can see good coming out of it as well. People sort of reassessed, and a lot of people who I know people who are sort of veering towards extremism in inverted commas. When they saw that, they were so horrified by this. Oh gosh, we're not going to go anywhere near that. There was more, interfaith work in Cambridge when mosques were being sort of attacked in America in kind of retaliation for 9/11, and here there were some sort of Muslims who suffered some attacks. Actually, we had Jewish and Christian groups coming to the mosque to just show solidarity with us. So that's good that came out of it. Maybe there's more of a desire for understanding. There's more of a desire for violence on one side, but more of a desire for understanding after it. So there is always good that comes out of it, although we can't always see it. It doesn't justify what was done, but there can be redemption for the world afterwards.
Yes.
What do you believe about Prophet Jesus?
Okay, so Prophet Jesus was just that, a prophet. Peace be upon him, and his story is mentioned with great length, and there's a chapter entitled after his mother's name, right, Mary. And Mary, mother of Jesus, that's her title. She's not Mary, daughter of so-and-so, she's Mary, mother of Jesus. And Jesus is a prophet that carries the message just like all the other prophets, and who came to the Jews at his time and was preaching the same thing that all of the other prophets were preaching, was just to worship God and to be kind and so on and so forth. And his virtues are many. He's mentioned, I think, over 100 times in the Quran, just his name. So he has a very virtuous prophet. He's one of the 5 noble prophets that came with his scripture. But he's not, for Muslims, the son of God. And he is not God in man form. He is a prophet, a messenger. And that he did not die, but that he was resurrected by God when he was betrayed. He was resurrected by God, and that he will actually come back to fight the Antichrist. The end of time there will be an Antichrist. And that Jesus is the one, Jesus is it's called the Messiah in the Quran as well. He is the one who will come and who will kill the Antichrist. Right? And
will
that
God,
will
sorry,
pardon me?
he is the one who will come and do what?
And kill the Antichrist. He will be the one who comes to fight the Antichrist. And complete the rest of his life and die normally, just like all the other people. So there's not that conception that he was the son of God, or that he was God in man form and the Trinity and that kind of thing. We don't have that. It's not quite the same. He's a prophet. He's a very special prophet, but he's not the son of God. So that's kind of where the difference is. Did you want to follow?
So do you think that if he was a prophet like the rest of the others, so do you think that he is lying when he claimed to be? Do you think he's just misguided?
We don't think that he ever claimed to be the son of God.
He never said it himself, but a lot of people said it about him.
Yeah, that's it. That's it. And that's
He
actually,
never said it.
there's a, I don't remember it verbatim, but there's an ayah in the Quran where it says, what the people who said you were the son of God, he says, I didn't say I was the son of God, I said I was the messenger of God. And they were led astray. Right? So for us, when we have the story written out in the Quran, that he never ever says that he's the son of God. He's the messenger of God.
Sorry, so there is a narration about the Antichrist. I think you're a bit startled by Jesus killing the Antichrist. There's a narration actually that the Antichrist will dissolve when he sees Jesus. So it may not be
He's the Christ, when he's fighting the Antichrist.
That's right, yeah. So
He will battle him, right?
Yeah.
His presence will battle him.
And also, so with Jesus, so in terms of the Son of God, so as we said before, we believe that the Quran is the intact revelation that has been preserved. We have the same thing, whereas with the accounts we have of Jesus' life, we have different accounts, and we don't believe that they have the same authenticity. So they differ slightly, and so anything that suggests that Jesus said he was God or the literal Son of God, we wouldn't accept. And then in terms of the Son of God, then we know that many people are called the Son of God in the Bible. Adam was called the Son of God, others were called the Son of God. So if one means it in a metaphorical way and not literally God's Son, then there'd be no harm in it. And actually the bigger thing is if sort of many Christians would say that you have to believe that God came down as a man and Jesus was God, that even in the Bible we have today, there's nothing really that you can find where Jesus unequivocally says himself that I am God, or worship me, or anything like that. But it's a kind of long-standing discussion. We don't regard it as an accurate record anyway. We believe that, and historians have shown that there were sects at that time who did not believe he was God or the Son of God, and they believed he was something approaching what Muslims would say a prophet of God. So there were sects at that time. 300 or so years after Jesus' time, you had the Council of Nicaea, where they decided that Jesus was of the same substance as God, and they persecuted those who didn't believe that. So there were sects at that time who believed in something very similar to what Muslims believe in, and Hans Kung, a Catholic theologian, might be excommunicated actually, but he talks about how he finds it difficult to see how there could be a historical link between those sects that he believes were, on the original religion of Jesus and Muhammad. It's difficult because Muhammad seems to come, peace be upon him, 600 years later and preaches the same message as what many scholars believe was the original message of Jesus, or what those sects were believing who were later persecuted. And he can't see a historical link. Obviously we'd say, well yes, because it's God revealing the same thing to him as he revealed centuries earlier, so it's the same thing. Other biblical scholars we've got Matthew, Mark, Luke and John if you put it in chronological order, it's thought to be Mark, Matthew, Luke, and then John. And when you look through it, you get what they call an ascending Christology. But Mark, which is closer to the time of Jesus, if you look at the Gospel of Mark, it's very similar to what Muslims would regard as a prophet. There's very little in the Gospel of Mark Muslims will take an objection to. But by the time you get to the Gospel of John and the writings of Paul, which is a kind of another discussion completely, you get something quite different. Jesus was the Son of God. Jesus came down literally for this specific purpose, to die for the sins of mankind. So Muslims would say that kind of is consistent with our belief that it was something that evolved with time rather than what Jesus originally came with. And our belief is that you can ask God sincerely for forgiveness. You don't need a salvific sacrifice. God created us with a propensity. This goes back to the existence of evil. The Prophet Muhammad said, you will sin and you will ask God for forgiveness sincerely and he will forgive you. And if you didn't sin, he will replace you with another people who sinned so they could ask him for forgiveness so that he would forgive them. So it's an attribute of God to forgive. But it's a one-to-one thing. You just sincerely ask God for forgiveness. You don't need an intermediate sort of sacrifice.
One last question, because we need to draw to a close. Anyone? Last question? Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Just trying to wrap that up, because you were mentioning the Antichrist and kind of evil and everything. So if God has planned everything, and there is destiny and everything's going to happen for a reason, then what do you believe about Antichrist? Like, why would we live saving? Hasn't this been planned exactly how it's meant to be? Is there any kind of future for society? Because I don't have the feeling that you feel this world needs to be saved, or there's anything inherently wrong with it, or do you think there is some kind of
we believe there's an existence of evil. So in terms of why did God allow it and stuff, we've sort of dealt with that for wisdoms that we can't fathom. So there is a lot wrong with the world. There's no doubt people sin, but we don't believe it's like an original sin that was upon mankind. But people sin from their own free will, and there's redemption always available to them. But sincerely to ask God themselves, without God either suffering himself or paying a ransom, and even that whole issue of whether it was a ransom or forgiveness is you can't do both at the same time. So we don't believe that a sacrifice is needed for God to come down, or an innocent man to suffer, or anything like that. It's us to ask sincerely for forgiveness. In terms of the world being saved, we don't know the future, and we know that the world centuries ago, many parts of it were, in some ways a much better place than it is now, and maybe it's heading for a worse future or a better future, and the Prophet Muhammad would always be optimistic, so we have a good opinion of the future. We hope for the best, we work to the best. In terms of what happens at the end times, we don't know when that is, whether in a few years, in 1,000 years, we don't know. So, but in terms of that description of the Antichrist coming at that time, that will be something that will happen at that time. The Antichrist will come, he'll have lots of followers, and Jesus will come down at that time. So Jesus hasn't died, but he's been taken up, and he'll come down at that time, and the Antichrist will be dealt with. And there's a lot of narrations about it. So Jesus will come down and with two angels, and with his hair as if it were wet, and some say it's because of Gethsemane he'd just been anointed with oil, and then he went up. That's a different discussion maybe. But he'll come down, and the Muslims will be behind this righteous Imam, the Mahdi, and he'll step back for Jesus to lead the prayer. Jesus will put his hand on his shoulders and say, "No, you lead the prayer," so he'll pray behind him. So coming as a follower of the Prophet Muhammad, and then he'll deal with the Antichrist. And then the years in which Jesus rules will be the best time that this world has ever experienced. And the Prophet Muhammad has said that at that time, there'll be no enmity between any two people. I can't remember the actual narration, but some, even animals won't hurt anyone, and it'll be a great time. But that's a time in the future, obviously for us, is not to be kind of defeatist and say, right, that'll be the great time and you don't need to do anything. But for us, it's to trying to improve the lot of everyone today and implement God's guidance, and not to think that redemption's coming later, we don't need to do anything.
Great, thanks. So just want to thank everyone for coming. We have some material on the table just over there, and a book for sale about the Prophet Muhammad's life. There are some members of the ISoc around if you want to speak to us afterwards. And there'll be refreshments upstairs. If you just come out of this door and turn right immediately, go up the stairs, we've got some refreshments for you. The next event is tomorrow by Idris Tawfiq, who will be explaining his Islam. He used to be a Roman Catholic priest, so he was a very interesting story. That's at 6:30 at the Cambridge Union. And by your feet, you'll probably see some feedback forms and recommendations for further reading. If you could fill that